Her hands, which once held those of her beloved while life slipped through his fingers, now tremble under the cold rain of Wyoming. In her eyes, the reflection of a war that took everything from her. Mary Beth Callahan seeks a future for her children among the snow and silence. But in a solitary cabin, other hands that also know pain and loss, will teach her that the deepest wounds can become the most powerful medicine. If this story of second chances touched your heart, give us a like as one lights a candle in the darkness, and tell us, how do you think this journey between two souls marked by the same pain will end? The cold bit like a hungry animal. January of 1883 punished the plains of Wyoming with an icy breath that turned tears into crystals before they could slide down cheeks. Mary Beth Callahan observed the white horizon from the wagon seat while her hands, reddened and cracked, held the reins with the firmness she had learned to maintain since James did not return from Gettysburg. The wind whistled through the distant pines, bringing with it fragments of memories that Mary Beth tried to banish. Virginia no longer existed for her, not the Virginia of green fields where she had been born, nor the Virginia of improvised hospitals where she had served as a nurse, changing bandages soaked in blood and holding the hands of boys who called for their mothers while life escaped through their fingers. "Mom, how much longer until Montana?" asked Elias, poking his head through the canvas that covered the back of the wagon. His 10 years showed in a thin face with eyes too serious for his age. 3 more days, maybe 4, if the snow keeps falling. "Like this," she replied, trying to make her voice sound warmer than the air surrounding them. Inside the wagon, Clara dozed wrapped in blankets. Her 7 years were a miracle that Mary Beth contemplated each night. She had been born when cannons already thundered in the distance, when cotton in the fields rotted unharvested because men were too busy killing each other over ideals that no child could understand. Her cousin's letter in Helena was the only tangible thing Mary Beth could cling to. "There is space here to begin again," he had written. "The war has not left its mark so deeply on these lands." But as the wagon moved heavily along paths barely visible under the snow, Mary Beth wondered if there really existed any place where the scars did not reach. The horse, a chestnut Percheron she had acquired in exchange for her wedding ring, snorted, forming clouds of vapor that quickly dissipated. Mary Beth noticed how the animal tensed at every creak of the branches laden with snow. Inside her coat, next to her chest, she carried the last portrait of James, painted just a week before he departed in his blue uniform toward a war that would devour half a generation of men. "We will see the snow-covered mountains," she whispered to herself like a litany. "We will see how the sun tints them pink at dawn." But for now, she only saw the endless whiteness and felt the weight of a past that refused to stay behind, clinging to her boots like the frozen mud of the road. The wind changed direction at dusk, bringing with it a blanket of low clouds that hid the last rays of the sun. Mary Beth perceived the change in the air before the first gusts hit the wagon. It smelled of new snow, of imminent storm. "Elias, make sure your sister is well secured," she ordered, scrutinizing the horizon for some shelter. The storm fell upon them like a silent predator. First came scattered, almost delicate snowflakes, which soon transformed into a dense curtain that barely allowed visibility beyond the horse. The animal whinnied nervously, its ears pressed against its skull, its hooves faltering on terrain that was becoming treacherous. "Mom!" Elias's voice sounded muffled by the roar of the wind. "Clara is scared." "Tell her to sing," replied Mary Beth, remembering how her own mother had calmed her during the storms of her childhood. "Tell her to sing that lullaby her father liked." Through the howl of the gale, Clara's childish voice began to rise, fragile as a silk thread amid the tempest. Mary Beth gripped the reins more tightly, her knuckles white from effort and cold. The Percheron moved forward more and more slowly, shaking its head as if trying to free itself from an invisible presence. It was then that the howl came, long and chilling, almost human in its modulation. The horse reared violently. Mary Beth tried to control the reins, but her numbed hands failed. The wagon swayed dangerously on the edge of what appeared to be an embankment. "Hold on tight," she shouted, but her voice was lost in the fury of the storm. The world tilted. Mary Beth felt herself falling, time slowing down as the wagon overturned on its right side. There was a terrible cracking sound, a scream she recognized as Elias's, and then the impact that robbed her of breath. She rolled down the slope, each blow a painful reminder that she was still alive, until her body stopped against something solid. When she managed to get up, disoriented, panic invaded her. The wagon lay destroyed several meters above, but the horse had fled, dragging with it part of the remains. With Clara inside, Elias, Clara. Her voice sounded strange, as if it belonged to someone else. "Mom!" The answer came weakly, from somewhere lower on the slope. It hurts a lot." Following the sound, Mary Beth crawled through the snow until she found her son. Elias lay in a small ravine, his right leg bent at an impossible angle, his face contorted with pain. Blood, dark against the snow, flowed from a wound on his forehead. "Don't move, darling," she whispered, quickly assessing the wounds with the trained eyes of someone who had seen too much. "We need to find Clara." But as she spoke those words, Mary Beth looked around and saw only the white, implacable vastness. Clara had disappeared along with the horse and the remains of the wagon. Night was falling rapidly, and with it the temperature. If they didn't find shelter soon, the cold would kill them as effectively as a bullet. With superhuman effort, Mary Beth lifted Elias in her arms. The boy suppressed a cry of pain but did not cry. He never did, not since she had shown him James's portrait and told him that he was now the man of the family. Moving blindly through the storm, Mary Beth prayed silently, not to a God she was no longer sure she believed in, but to the memory of James, asking him to guide her steps toward Clara, toward salvation, toward any place where death was not waiting with its arms of ice wide open. The light flickered between the trees like a fallen star. Mary Beth saw it through her frost-covered eyelashes, an improbable beacon in the white immensity. She had been walking for what seemed like hours, with Elias semi-conscious in her arms, her own legs moving through sheer obstinacy rather than strength. "There's light," she whispered in her son's ear. "We're going to be all right." As they approached, the light took shape. It was a window illuminated by the warm glow of a fire. A log cabin emerged from the darkness, solid and real among the snow-covered pines. The smoke rising from the chimney dispersed in the icy air like a promise. Mary Beth stumbled the last few meters to the door. She had no strength to knock. She simply collapsed against the wood, her body acting as a final shield to protect Elias from the cold. The door opened so suddenly that they both fell forward. Strong hands held them before they touched the ground. "My God," said a deep voice. "Come in quickly." The heat of the interior was almost painful against her frozen skin. Mary Beth blinked, trying to focus her sight on the face of the man who had received them. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with an angular face framed by a chestnut beard with silver strands. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, clear blue like a summer sky, incongruous with the severity of the rest of his features. "My daughter," stammered Mary Beth, the words forming with difficulty in her numb mouth. "Clara. She was lost when the wagon—" "A little girl," interrupted the man as he placed Elias with surprising gentleness on a bed near the fire. "Blonde hair, with a blue coat." "Have you seen her?" The man pointed toward a corner of the room. There, asleep in an armchair too large for her small body, was Clara. Her chest rose and fell regularly, her face serene as if the storm raging outside had never existed. "I found her an hour ago," he explained, already kneeling beside Elias to examine his leg. "The horse galloped past my cabin, dragging the remains of a wagon. She was clinging to a trunk, almost frozen but unharmed." Mary Beth staggered toward her daughter, touching her warm cheek as if to make sure she was real. Clara murmured something in her sleep but did not wake. "Thank you." The words seemed insufficient, a container too small to hold the magnitude of her gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Carson," he replied, without lifting his gaze from Elias's leg, which he examined with expert hands. "Nathaniel Carson, but everyone calls me Nate." He paused, evaluating the fracture. "Your son has a broken tibia, clean, fortunately, and that wound on his forehead will need a few stitches." There was something in the precision of his movements, in the clinical calm of his voice, that aroused Mary Beth's curiosity despite her exhaustion. "Are you a docky? Tor?" A shadow crossed Nate's face, so fleeting that Mary Beth thought she had imagined it. "I was," he answered dryly. Now I'm just a man who lives in the forest." He stood up and went to a cabinet from which he extracted bandages, glass bottles, with liquids of various colors, and what appeared to be a surgeon's case. His movements were precise, economical, as if each gesture had been rehearsed 1,000 times. "I need you to help me," he said, returning to Elias. "I'm going to set the bone in place, and I need you to hold him." Marybeth nodded, positioning herself where Nate indicated. She had assisted in similar procedures during the war, had seen bones, shattered by musket balls and limbs, amputated with no more anesthesia than a piece of leather between the teeth. Elias's leg, in comparison, was almost a relief. As they worked together in silence, Marybeth observed Nate's hands, large but surprisingly agile, with old scars crossing the knuckles. They were hands that had seen the inside of human bodies, that knew the secret map of veins and tendons. Hands that, like hers, had tried to repair what the violence of men had destroyed. When they finished splinting Elias's leg and suturing the wound on his forehead, the boy was sleeping deeply, sedated by a bitter brew that Nate had administered. The storm continued to lash the cabin, but inside the fire crackled with a comforting constancy. "You should stay until the weather improves," said Nate, washing his hands in a basin. "It's not safe to travel with the boy in that state, and the storm could last for days." Marybeth felt exhaustion finally catching up with her, like a wave that had been chasing her for miles. "We have nothing to pay you with," she murmured, humiliation coloring her words. Nate looked at her directly in the eyes for the first time, and Marybeth felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. "I'm not asking for payment," he replied in a grave voice. "I'm only offering shelter to those who need it." And there was something in his way of saying it, a kind of silent penance. That made Marybeth wonder what kind of debts this man believed he had to settle. The fever came during the night, stealthy as a thief. Marybeth woke at dawn with the instinctive feeling that something was wrong. Elias burned, his skin a brazier under the blankets, his cheeks tinged with an alarming crimson. His breathing was shallow and rapid, like that of a small, trapped animal. "Doctor." "Carson," she called, forgetting in her panic that he no longer considered himself a doctor. Nate appeared from an adjoining room, his hair tousled, but his eyes alert despite the hour. One look was enough to assess the situation. "The wound must have become infected," he murmured, placing a hand on Elias's forehead. Or perhaps the cold had already penetrated too deeply into his lungs. He pushed aside the blankets and methodically examined the boy. His fingers felt the neck, chest, lymph nodes. He paused to listen to the breathing, inclining his head as if trying to decipher a coded message in each labored inhalation. "Is he going to—" Marybeth could not finish the question. She had seen too many young men succumb to similar fevers, their bodies burning until consumed from within. "Not if we can help it," replied Nate with a firmness that contrasted with the gravity of his expression. "I need my herbs." He headed towards what appeared to be a back door. When he opened it, a warm, humid vapor briefly flooded the room, laden with vegetable aromas, moist earth and something else, something medicinal and ancient. Marybeth peered over his shoulder, and what she saw left her breathless. Attached to the cabin was a structure of glass and wood, an improbable greenhouse in the middle of Wyoming winter. Inside, rows of plants grew in orderly pots, some with flowers of impossible colors, others with leaves that seemed to glow under. The faint dawn light filtering through the snow accumulated on the glass roof. "It's extraordinary," she whispered. Nate glanced at her sidelong as he selected leaves from various plants with the precision of an apothecary. "It's necessary," he corrected. "Here the winters are long, and one cannot always depend on supplies." From town. While he worked, Marybeth returned to Elias. Clara was still sleeping, oblivious to the crisis. She placed a damp cloth on her son's forehead, an almost ritual gesture she had repeated countless times beside the camp beds. "You're going to be fine," she whispered, not knowing if she was trying to convince Elias or herself. "You're strong, like your father." Nate returned with a steaming bowl that gave off a penetrating aroma, halfway between medicinal and floral. "I need you to lift him a little," he indicated, kneeling beside the bed. "He has to drink this." Between the two of them, they managed to get Elias to drink the brew. The boy grimaced at the taste but was too weak to protest. When they laid him back down, Nate prepared a poultice with some of the plants and applied it to the little one's chest. "I learned about these herbs from the Shoshone," he explained as he worked. "This one here reduces fever, and this other one," he pointed to a plant with narrow dark leaves, "helps the lungs expel fluid. I served as a nurse during the war," said Mary Beth, observing his movements, "but I never saw remedies like these." Something tensed in Nate's jaw, a muscle that pulsed briefly under the skin. "The medicine I learned at university rarely contemplated the knowledge of those who have been on these lands for centuries," he replied after a moment. "That was my mistake, one of many. They worked in silence for hours, taking turns to watch over Elias, changing compresses, administering more infusions when the fever threatened to rise too high. By midday, Clara awoke, and after the initial confusion, sat beside her brother, with the solemnity of a girl who has learned too early that life is fragile. "Mom says you're a doctor," she said to Nate with the frankness of childhood. "Why do you live alone in the forest? Doctors should be where there are sick people." Mary Beth opened her mouth to reprimand her, but Nate stopped her with a gesture. "Sometimes, little one," he replied with no trace of condescension in his voice, "a doctor needs to learn to heal his own wounds before trying to heal those of others." Clara nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense. Perhaps it did, thought Mary Beth, for someone who had not yet learned to complicate the simple with the weight of prejudices and expectations. Toward the afternoon, Elias's fever began to subside. His breathing became deeper, more regular, and a slight color returned to his lips. Mary Beth felt something loosen in her chest, a knot that had been there since the wagon overturned, perhaps from much earlier. When at last she allowed herself to sit by the fire, exhaustion fell over her like a heavy blanket. Nate offered her a cup of coffee, black and strong. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, a fleeting contact that sent an unexpected tingling up her arm. "Thank you," she said, and this time the word seemed less inadequate. "For everything." Nate sat across from her, his clear eyes reflecting the flames. "Where were you headed?" he asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "Montana." "Helena, my cousin has land there." Nate nodded slowly. "It's a good place. Less wild than these parts. Have you been there?" "I've been many places," he replied, and something in his tone suggested that none of them had been a home. "The war took us all to places we never planned to be." The mention of the war hung between them like an unasked question. Mary Beth knew she should let it pass, that she had learned not to probe the wounds of others. But there was something about this man, in his deliberate solitude, in his knowledge, in his capable hands and his eyes, that seemed to have seen too much, that awakened in her a curiosity she thought she had buried, along with James. "Where are you from originally, Dr. Carson?" "Virginia," he answered after a pause, "though I doubt I could recognize it if I returned now." Virginia. The word resonated in Mary Beth's chest like the echo of a distant shot. Her home and his, devastated by the same war that had led them both to this point, to this cabin in the middle of nowhere, where the past seemed to lurk from the shadows beyond the circle of firelight. The days slipped one after another like beads, on a rosary, similar in form but each with its own weight, its own texture. The storm abated, but the accumulated snow made travel impossible. Elias's leg needed time to begin healing, and although the fever had subsided, his body was still weak. Clara was the first to adapt to her new surroundings. With the elasticity of childhood, she soon made the cabin her territory. Mary Beth watched her move through the spaces with growing familiarity, helping Nate classify herbs, listening to his explanations about each plant with solemn attention, or simply sitting by the window, drawing imaginary shapes on the fogged glass. It was during the fourth day when Nate, after observing Mary Beth change a bandage with expert hands, proposed that she visit the greenhouse. "You seem to have knowledge," he said, with that economy of words that Mary Beth had come to expect from him. "Perhaps you'd be interested in seeing my experiments." The greenhouse was even more impressive seen from inside. The humid heat contrasted deliciously with the dry cold of the cabin. Rows of plants grew in an order that only Nate seemed to understand. Some in clay pots, others in glass containers where the roots were visible, forming intricate Patterns under the clear water. How do you maintain the temperature? Asked Mary Beth, fascinated by the ingenuity of the construction. Nate pointed to a system of pipes that connected to the main fireplace of the cabin. The water circulates, heated by the fire, he explained. I took the idea from Roman baths, though adapted to my needs. As they walked the narrow aisle between the cultivation tables, Nate pointed out each plant, naming it first in Latin and then explaining its properties. Antipyretic, antiseptic, for respiratory problems, for joint pain, for wounds that wouldn't heal. This one, he said, stopping before a plant with oval leaves and tiny white flowers, is especially valuable. The Shoshone call it the one that whispers to bones. It helps broken bones heal more quickly. I'm using it in the poultices for Elias. Mary Beth touched a leaf with her fingertips. It was velvety, almost warm to the touch. During the war, she said, the words coming out before she could contain them, I would have given anything to have access to remedies like these. We lost so many men to infections, to fevers that wouldn't break. She stopped, aware that she had revealed more than she intended. Nate observed her with an intensity that made her feel strangely exposed, as if he could see through the layers of reserve she had built around her memories. The remedies were there, he replied finally. They were always there, in the forests, in the fields, but we were too busy killing each other to pay attention. There was a bitterness in his voice that resonated with the one Mary Beth carried. Inside, that muted rage against a war that had taken so much and resolved so little. May I ask you something personal, Dr. Carson? He nodded, though his posture tensed slightly. Why did you choose this place so remote? Nate took his time to respond, as if weighing how much to reveal. After the war, I discovered that I know. Longer fit anywhere, he said at last. The cities were too noisy, too full of people who wanted to forget or who refused to do so. Here, he made a gesture encompassing the greenhouse. Here I only have to answer to the plants. And they don't. Ask questions about the past. Mary Beth understood then that this greenhouse was more than a means of survival. It was a refuge, a place where Nate tried to rebuild something that the war had shattered. She didn't know if it was his soul, his faith in humanity, or simply his ability to live among others without the weight of memories crushing him. Plants. Don't judge, she murmured, almost to herself. No, confirmed Nate. They just grow toward the light no matter how many times they're pruned or transplanted. There's a lesson there, I suppose. They continued the tour in a silence that no longer felt uncomfortable. Mary Beth observed Nate's hands as he worked, how they paused over each plant with a delicacy incongruous with their size, how they seemed to know exactly the pressure needed to prune a stem or remove a withered leaf. They were the hands of a healer, she thought, and she wondered what wounds, besides the physical ones, those hands had tried to cure. I think Elias will be able to stand with the help of crutches in a few days, said Nate, as they returned to the cabin. The bone is responding well. And then we can continue our journey, asked Mary Beth, surprised by the ambivalence she felt at the idea. Nate glanced at her sidelong. If that is what you wish. And there was something in his tone, a barely perceptible note of interrogation, that made Mary Beth wonder if he too felt this strange reluctance at the idea of their departure. Upon re-entering the cabin, they found Clara sitting next to Elias, clumsily reading to him from a botany book she had found on Nate's bookshelf. The scene had a domesticity that Mary Beth had not experienced since before the war. The crackling fire, her children safe, the aroma of a stew cooking slowly. And for a moment, just for a moment, she allowed herself to imagine that this cabin, in the middle of the forest, was not a temporary stop on her journey, but a destination in itself. The visitor arrived on the 7th day, when the sun had just begun to melt the upper layer of snow. Mary Beth was on the porch, shaking out the blankets, when she spotted the figure approaching among the trees. An older woman wrapped in furs, with black hair streaked with grey gathered in 2 long braids. She moved with the assurance of one who knows the forest like the palm of her hand. Nate came out of the cabin at the sound of the dog's bark that accompanied the woman. "Singing bird," he greeted, descending the steps to meet her. The woman inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement. Her dark, perceptive eyes evaluated Mary Beth with interest, but without hostility. "You have found company, Nate Carson," she said. In fluent English, though, marked by an accent Mary Beth couldn't identify. Winter has brought you gifts this year. Something like a smile momentarily softened Nate's severe features. Singing Bird. This is Mary Beth Callahan, and her children are inside, their wagon overturned during the storm. The storm brings what? We need not always what we want, the woman replied enigmatically. The winter spirits have their own designs. Mary Beth perceived that beneath the mysticism of her words was a sharp intelligence and a warmth that contradicted her stoic appearance. It's a pleasure to meet you, ma'am, she said, extending a hand that the woman grasped firmly. Singing Bird is not ma'am, she corrected with a slight smile. Just Singing Bird. I come from the Shoshone people, 2 days' journey to the west. Nate led them into the cabin, where Clara immediately approached the visitor with the uninhibited curiosity of childhood. To Mary Beth's surprise, Singing Bird knelt to be at the girl's height and, without a word, extracted from among her clothing a small object that she offered to Clara, a figure carved in pine wood representing a bird with outstretched wings. For you, little one who survived the storm, she said, the snowbird always finds its way home. Clara accepted the gift with reverence, her fingers tracing the delicate contours of the carving. It's beautiful, she whispered. Thank you. Elias watched from the bed, now able to sit though his leg was still immobilized. Singing Bird approached him, examining Nate's work with an expert eye. You've used the whispering herb, she commented, nodding with approval. And I see the fever has subsided. This boy has a strong spirit. Like his mother, replied Nate, and Mary Beth felt heat rising to her cheeks at the unexpected compliment. Singing. Bird looked at them alternately, a flash of something like amusement gleaming in her dark eyes. I have not come only to check who occupies Nate Carson's cabin, she said, returning to the purpose of her visit. I bring bad news. My grandson, Little Wolf, is sick. The red fever has returned. Mary Beth saw how Nate's face transformed, all personal expression erased under the mask of the doctor. Scarlet fever? He asked, already heading toward his medical bag. How many days? 3. The throat is like fire and the skin like autumn berries. Other children? Not yet. We have kept him separate, as you taught us the last time. Nate gathered bottles and bandages with methodical efficiency, storing them in a worn leather bag. I'll go with you right now, he said, but I'll need more foxglove than I have here. I'll have to collect it on the way. Mary Beth, who had followed the exchange with growing understanding, stepped forward. I can help, she offered. I worked with cases of scarlet fever during the epidemic of '64 at the Richmond Hospital. Nate looked at her with surprise, as if he had forgotten her presence for a moment. I can't ask you to take the risk, he replied, though Mary Beth perceived the doubt in his voice. Scarlet fever is dangerous, especially for children. Clara, I already had it, interrupted Mary Beth. And Elias too, 2 years ago. We're immunized. She looked at her children, evaluating the situation. Clara can take care of Elias while we're away. It won't be for long, will it? 2 days, perhaps 3, replied Singing Bird. The camp is not far, but the path is difficult with the snow. Mary Beth turned to her children. Elias nodded gravely, understanding the importance of the situation. We can stay alone, Mum, he said with the seriousness of one who has assumed responsibilities prematurely. I'll take care of Clara. And I'll take care of Elias, added Clara, pressing the wooden figure to her chest like a talisman. Singing Bird contemplated the scene with approval. Children who have known loss mature like berries under the first frost, she observed. Sweet, but with a deeper flavor. The decision was made. While Nate and Singing Bird prepared the horses, Mary Beth quickly organized provisions for her children and packed the essentials for the journey. In less than an hour, the 3 adults were riding westward, leaving the cabin behind, a point of light that diminished until it disappeared among the trees. Mary Beth could not explain the strange mixture of emotions she felt. Concern for her children, anxiety for the sick child, and something else, something that had to do with Nate's straight-back riding in front of her, with the way his shoulders carried an invisible weight that she was beginning to sense as he. They advanced in silence through the snowy forest. Mary Beth realized that, for the first time since James's death, she was moving toward something instead of away from something. The sensation was as unexpected as the warmth that began to grow in her chest, defying the cold of the Wyoming winter. The Shoshone camp emerged like an apparition through the dusk mist, a circle of teepees whose yellowish hides gleamed with the light of interior fires. The smoke ascended in lazy spirals toward a sky that was beginning to be speckled with stars, increasingly bright as darkness gained ground. The arrival of Singing Bird with the two strangers did not go unnoticed. Curious faces emerged from the tents, observing with a mixture of reserve and hope. A middle-aged man, with the dignified bearing of one who holds authority, came forward to receive them. "My son, Running Eagle," presented Singing Bird, Little Wolf's father. The man inclined his head slightly toward Nate. "Medicine Man," he said, using what was clearly a familiar nickname. "You have come." "Whenever you need me," replied Nate with simplicity. "I have brought help. Mrs. Callahan has experience with the red fever." Running Eagle's dark eyes evaluated Mary Beth for an instant before nodding in acceptance. There was no time for ceremonies or distrust when a child's life hung by a thread. They were led to the largest teepee in the circle, decorated with symbols that Mary Beth could not interpret, but that she intuited had meanings related to healing and protection. Inside, the air was dense and warm, perfumed with herbs that burned slowly in a small brazier. In the center, on a bed of furs, lay a boy of no more than 6 years. His copper skin was covered by the scarlet eruption characteristic of the disease, and his breathing was labored, interrupted by a dry cough that seemed to tear his throat. Beside him, a young woman applied damp compresses to his forehead, murmuring words of comfort in her native language. "My daughter-in-law, Gentle Rain," explained Singing Bird. Nate immediately knelt beside the boy, his movements acquiring that clinical precision that Mary Beth had observed when he treated Elias. His hands examined the inflamed throat, the glands, the pulse in the tiny wrist. "The fever is very high," he murmured, more to himself than to the others, "and the rash is at its peak." Mary Beth joined him, observing the symptoms with a trained eye. "The breathing is too rapid," she pointed out, "and his lips have a bluish tone." Nate nodded, his face grave. "The heart is under too much pressure. We need to bring down the fever right now." Without need for more words, they both began to work together with the instinctive synchronization of those who share not only knowledge, but also a kind of silent language born of similar experiences. Mary Beth prepared the compresses, while Nate extracted from his bag the bottles he had brought, mixing tinctures with hot water in precise proportions. The night advanced slowly, measured by Little Wolf's irregular breathing and the crackling of the fire that Gentle Rain kept burning. Every hour, Mary Beth and Nate changed the compresses, administered more medicine, checked the vital signs. The other family members came in and out of the tent, bringing fresh water, food that remained untouched, words of encouragement that floated in the charged air. At some point near midnight, when the fever seemed to resist all their efforts, Nate went out briefly and returned with a small leather pouch. "I need your help," he said to Mary Beth, unfolding what appeared to be surgical instruments along with several small bottles on a blanket. "We're going to prepare a stronger solution." As they worked side by side, mixing extracts, heating compounds, Mary Beth observed the absolute concentration on Nate's face. There was something moving about the way this man, who had chosen isolation, gave himself completely to the task of saving a life. "Where did you learn to prepare these remedies?" she asked in a low voice, while crushing dried leaves following his instructions. "I don't remember them being taught in any medical school." A shadow crossed Nate's face. "Some I learned during the war, when supplies were scarce and we had to improvise," he replied, without lifting his gaze from his work. "Others were taught to me by Singing Bird, and many—" he paused, his hands stopping momentarily. "I learned in a prison." The revelation hung between them, heavy with implications that Mary Beth did not dare to explore at that moment. It was not the place nor the time to unearth ghosts, not when a child's life hung by a thread. At dawn, the crisis reached its culmination. Little Wolf's fever reached alarming levels, his small body shaken by convulsions that Mary Beth and Nate tried to control with firm but gentle hands. Gentle Rain wept silently in a corner, while Running Eagle remained standing, motionless, his face an impenetrable mask that only his eyes, bright with anguish, contradicted. "We need to immerse him," Nate finally decided. "The fever is too high." They quickly prepared a bath with lukewarm water mixed with herbs. With infinite care, they introduced the boy, holding him while his burning body faced the shock of the contrast. Little Wolf moaned weakly, his eyes opening for the first time in hours, unfocused and confused. "You are safe, little warrior," murmured Nate in the Shoshone language, with a fluency that surprised Mary Beth. "Fight a little more, the sun is returning." She didn't know if it was the words, the bath, or the medicines they had been administering all night, but something changed in that moment. The boy's breathing began to regularize. The tension in his small body gradually yielded. By midday, the fever had lowered enough that they could lay him down again. His cheeks, though still tinged with red, no longer burned like embers. The rash was beginning to pale in some areas, a sign that the worst had passed. Singing Bird, who had been observing from a corner, approached Nate and Mary Beth. "The spirits have listened," she said simply, "and you have known how to interpret their whispers." Mary Beth, exhausted but relieved, let herself fall onto a low bench. Only then did she realize that Nate was sitting beside her, so close that their shoulders touched. She did not move away. There was something comforting in that contact, in the warmth that emanated from him, in the solidity of his presence. "We've done it," she murmured, the words barely audible. Nate did not respond with words. He simply covered Mary Beth's hand with his own, a gesture so brief that it could have been imagined. But that sent a current of something indefinable through her, something she had not felt since James departed for a war from which he would never return. And in that moment, in a Shoshone tent impregnated with medicinal aromas and wood smoke, Mary Beth realized that the journey that had begun fleeing from a painful past had led her, unexpectedly, toward a future she had not dared to imagine. The night that followed, the crisis was one of vigilance but no longer of fear. Little Wolf slept peacefully, his chest rising and falling with a rhythm that promised recovery. Nate and Mary Beth, temporarily relieved of their duties by gentle rain, accepted Running Eagle's invitation to share the communal meal around the central fire of the camp. The night sky of Wyoming unfolded above them like a mantle of black velvet, sprinkled with diamonds. The air was so clean, so cold that each star seemed within reach. Mary Beth, wrapped in a blanket that Singing Bird had lent her, contemplated the immensity with a mixture of awe and inner peace that she had not experienced in years. The food was simple but substantial, a thick stew of venison with roots and dried berries, accompanied by a flatbread cooked on hot stones. After almost 24 hours working tirelessly, the nourishment revitalized their exhausted bodies. The members of the camp gradually retired to their teepees, until only Mary Beth and Nate remained by the dying fire. Singing Bird had assigned them a small tent to rest, but neither seemed willing to yield to sleep yet, as if something remained pending between them, something that could only be said under the complicity of the stars. "They are good people," commented Mary Beth, breaking the silence. "They trusted us with the life of their son." Nate nodded, his profile outlined against the glow of the embers. "The Shoshone took me in when no one else would have," he replied, adding a log to the fire. "I owe them more than I can ever repay." Was it after? Mary Beth left the question in the air, aware that she was entering dangerous territory. Nate remained motionless for so long that Mary Beth thought he would not respond. When he finally spoke, his voice had a different tone, deeper, as if emerging from some dark well within him. "After the prison." "Yes." He threw another log onto the fire, and the sparks ascended toward the stars like fleeting messengers. "I served as a surgeon in the Confederate Army," he continued, the words now coming out with a regular cadence as if they had been waiting a long time to be pronounced. "I believed I was doing the right thing, attending to the wounded regardless of the cause for which they fought. But the war has ways of taking our best intentions and twisting them until they become unrecognizable." Mary Beth listened in silence, aware of the privilege that being the recipient of these confessions meant. "In Gettysburg I was captured," Nate continued, his gaze now fixed on the flames. "They gave me a choice. I could be treated as a prisoner of war, or I could continue practicing as a doctor, but for the other side. A bitter smile curved his lips. It wasn't really a choice. There were too many men suffering, too many boys dying. So, you treated Union soldiers, Marybeth completed softly, for 8 months, in the military hospital in Washington. Marybeth's heart skipped a beat. Washington, where James had been sent after being wounded at Gettysburg. And then they sent you to Libby, she said, almost without realizing that she had switched to the familiar form, as if the formal distance between them had evaporated with the confessions. Nate looked at her directly for the first time since he began his account, and Marybeth saw in his eyes a pain so raw, so visceral, that she had to resist the urge to look away. A soldier died on my operating table, the nephew of a general. It was septicemia. There was nothing I could do, but they needed a culprit, so... He shrugged, a gesture that was meant to downplay, but only underscored the injustice. They sent me to Libby as a prisoner, but with orders to attend to the sick. A prisoner doctor treating other prisoners with insufficient supplies in conditions, his voice broke slightly, inhumane. Marybeth shuddered. She had heard about the infamous Confederate prison in Richmond, known for its overcrowding, diseases, malnutrition, a place where death was more a release than a tragedy. I lost count of how many men died under my hands, he continued, his voice now barely a whisper. I tried to save them, but it was like trying to contain the ocean with bare hands. Each day we buried more bodies than the day before, and I began to feel that my hands no longer served to heal, but only to accompany the dying on their final journey. The silence that followed was laden with ghosts. Marybeth could almost see them, the shadows of those young men who had exhaled their last breath in a fetid prison, far from their homes, from their loved ones. When the war ended, Nate continued after a long moment, I couldn't return to Virginia. There was nothing to recover there. My home had been burned, my family dispersed or dead, and I no longer knew who I was. Confederate or Yankee, doctor or jailer, savior or executioner, everything had mixed into a bloody mud from which I could not escape. So you came west, Marybeth completed. I wandered for years. I worked as an itinerant doctor, following the railroad construction, attending to anyone who needed help. But the memories pursued me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of the men I couldn't save. He threw a final log onto the fire, and the flames were revived, illuminating his features with a golden glow that softened the lines of worry. It was Singing Bird who found me, he continued, his voice regaining some warmth. Literally found. Me half dead from pneumonia in a ravine 2 days from here. She healed me with her herbs and her wisdom, and when I was strong enough, she took me to a trapper's abandoned cabin and told me, here you can stop running, medicine man. Here you can begin to heal. Marybeth felt a lump in her throat. Nate's story resonated with her own, both marked by the war, both seeking a place where wounds could heal, where the past was not a perpetual condemnation. And now you, said Nate, turning to her, what really brought you to Montana? I don't think it's just the letter from a cousin. Marybeth contemplated the embers for a long moment. Confessions deserved reciprocity, and there was something about this place, this night, the presence of this man that made words flow more easily. The war took James, she began, but what came after almost destroyed me. Virginia was no longer home for a Union widow with 2 small children. Neighbors who used to smile at us now looked the other way. The plantation that had belonged to James's family was confiscated, then returned. But by then the debts... She made a vague gesture with her hand. Nothing was left. Nate listened with the same attention she had given him, his clear eyes reflecting. The dance of the flames. I tried to rebuild, Marybeth continued. I worked as a nurse, as a seamstress, even as a teacher for a time. But every street, every building, every face reminded me of what I had lost. And the children, they deserved better than a mother who lived with 1 foot in the past. She paused, surprised by the honesty of her own words. She had never admitted, not even to herself, how much her grief had affected Elias and Clara. So, when my cousin's letter arrived offering me a place in Montana, I saw it as a sign, an opportunity to leave behind not only the memories, but also the pain that had become my constant companion. The fire crackled, sending a new flurry of sparks toward the starry sky. "But now I wonder," she added, almost to herself, "if one can really escape the past, or if one simply carries it along like invisible baggage that can never be left at the station." Nate extended his hand toward her, a tentative gesture that Mary Beth received by intertwining her fingers with his. The contact, simple but deeply intimate, seemed to seal a kind of pact between them, a mutual recognition of shared wounds. "Don't think we can escape the past," he said finally, his grave voice mixing with the crackling of the fire. "But perhaps we can learn to carry it in a different way, not as a burden, but as a part of who we are. Like these scars." With his free hand he traced a line on his own cheek, where a fine white mark extended from the corner of his eye to his jaw, barely visible in the firelight. "Scars remind us that we survived," he continued, "that we are stronger than what tried to destroy us." Mary Beth nodded, understanding perfectly what Nate was trying to convey. She too carried scars, though hers were not visible on the skin. They remained like that, hands intertwined in front of the dying fire, under a sky so vast that it seemed capable of absorbing all human sorrows. And for the first time since James had departed for the front, Mary Beth felt that something inside her was beginning to thaw, like a river with the coming of spring, gradually freeing itself from the ice that had kept it captive during a winter. That was too long. The return to the cabin 2 days later had the quality of a homecoming that Mary Beth did not expect to feel. The sight of the wooden structure emerging among the snow-covered trees awakened in her an emotion that went beyond simple relief at finding shelter. Elias and Clara came out to greet them, their faces lighting up upon seeing them appear in the clearing. Elias's leg was still immobilized, but he had managed to move with the help of rudimentary crutches that he himself had fashioned. "Mom!" exclaimed Clara, running to meet her and embracing her waist. "Dr. Nate, did you save the boy?" "Yes, little one," replied Nate, dismounting with a fluid movement. "Little Wolf is better. He sends greetings to his friend of the carved bird." The pride that illuminated Clara's face was like a ray of sunshine in the middle of winter. She turned to Elias, who was advancing more slowly. "See, I told you they would succeed. Together they can heal anyone." There was an innocent wisdom in her words that made Mary Beth and Nate exchange a knowing look. During the return journey, something had changed between them. The confessions shared under the stars had created a bridge over the abyss of their divergent pasts, a connection that went beyond words. After accommodating the horses and unloading the few supplies that Singing Bird had provided them, they entered the cabin. The warmth received them like an embrace, along with the aroma of a stew that bubbled over the fire. "We prepared it for when you'd return," explained Elias with shyness. Clara collected the vegetables from the greenhouse, following the instructions the doctor left. "And I made sure the fire never went out," added Clara, her voice brimming with pride. "As you taught me, Mom." Mary Beth embraced her children, moved by their initiative, by the way they had turned these days of absence into an opportunity to demonstrate their worth. The meal took place in an atmosphere of natural camaraderie, with Clara monopolizing the conversation, anxious to know all the details about the Shoshone camp, while Elias listened attentively, his intelligent eyes moving from Nate to Mary Beth, perhaps detecting the subtle changes in the way they interacted. After dinner, when the children had gone to bed, Mary Beth and Nate remained by the fire sharing a cup of coffee. The silence between them was comfortable, like that of two people who have moved beyond the need to fill every pause with words. "Your children are extraordinary," Nate finally commented. "They have known how to adapt to circumstances that would have overwhelmed many adults." "They've had to grow up too quickly," replied Mary Beth, a tinge of sadness in her voice, "especially Elias. Sometimes I worry that he hasn't had time to be a child." "Children are more resilient than we think," said Nate, his eyes reflecting the flames. "They bend but don't break, like young reeds during a storm." Mary Beth nodded, recognizing the truth in his words. She was about to respond when a noise from the corner where the children slept drew her attention. It was Elias who had gotten up and was advancing toward them with the help of his crutches. "Can't you sleep, darling?" asked Mary Beth, concerned. Elias shook his head, his expression serious even by his usual standards. I I wanted to show you something, he said, his voice hesitant. I found something when we were cleaning. He headed with determination toward a corner of the cabin where a dark wooden trunk remained semi-hidden under a blanket. Marybeth had never paid attention to that object, assuming it contained Nate's personal belongings. Elias, you shouldn't have been rummaging through Dr. Carson's things, she began, uncomfortable with the intrusion into their host's privacy. I wasn't rummaging, the boy defended himself. It fell when I was sweeping, and then I saw this. With trembling hands, Elias extracted from the trunk a piece of faded blue cloth. Even in the amber light of the fire, Marybeth immediately recognized the color. Union blue, the same shade of the uniform that James had worn the day he departed. Marybeth's heart began to beat forcefully. She saw how Nate tensed, his face visibly paling. "Why do you have a Union uniform, Doctor?" asked Elias, his voice laden with a distrust that echoed all the prejudices and resentments inherited from the war. "You were Confederate, Mum told me." The silence that followed was so dense that Marybeth could feel its weight on her shoulders. Nate looked at the piece of cloth as if it were a live snake, his knuckles white from tension. "Elias, that's not—" Marybeth began, but Nate interrupted her with a gesture. "No, he has a right to ask," he said, his voice strangely calm despite the storm that Marybeth could see in his eyes. "And he deserves an answer." He stood up and approached Elias, who was still holding the piece of uniform. With a gentleness that contrasted with the tension of the moment, Nate took the cloth from the boy's hands. "You're right, Elias, I was a Confederate surgeon," he began, slowly returning to his seat. "But as I told your mother, I was captured at Gettysburg and given the opportunity to continue practicing as a doctor, attending to Union soldiers in Washington." He spread the piece of cloth over his knees, smoothing it carefully, as if it were a valuable document. "This piece of uniform was given to me by one of my patients," he continued, his voice acquiring a distant tone, as if he were reciting a memorized passage from a forgotten book. "A man whose left arm I had to amputate after—" A bullet shattered his elbow. The operation was difficult, but he survived when many others would not have. Marybeth felt the air leaving her lungs. Could it be? No, it would be too great a coincidence, too cruel or too perfect. "The day before I was transferred to Libby, he came to see me," Nate continued, his eyes now fixed on the fire. "He gave me this piece of his uniform. He said he wanted me to have something to remember, that even in the midst of a war that pitted brother against brother, it was still possible to find humanity in the enemy." Elias listened attentively, his initial distrust yielding to the sincerity that emanated from Nate's words. "That man," intervened Marybeth, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you remember his name?" Nate looked up, and Marybeth saw in his eyes a sudden understanding, a recognition that made her heart stop for an instant. "Callahan," he finally replied. "James Callahan, lieutenant of the 14th Virginia Infantry Regiment, assigned to the Union." The world seemed to stop around Marybeth. The crackling of the fire, the whistle of the wind outside the cabin, everything was reduced to a distant hum, while Nate's words resonated in her mind. "My father," whispered Elias, his eyes widening. You knew my father." Nate nodded slowly, his gaze moving from Elias to Marybeth. "Now I understand why your name seemed familiar to me from the beginning," he said. "He talked about his wife Marybeth and his children constantly. He said that returning to you was the only thing that gave him strength to endure the pain." Marybeth brought a hand to her mouth, trying to contain the sob that threatened to escape. James had been under the care of this man. The hands that now held the piece of uniform were the same ones that had saved her husband's life, albeit temporarily. "What happened to him?" asked Nate, though by his expression Marybeth sensed that he already knew the answer. "When they took me to Libby, he was still recovering, but the doctors were optimistic." "Infection," replied Marybeth, the word coming out like a painful exhalation. 2 weeks after the operation, the wound seemed to be healing well, but suddenly it worsened. They allowed me to be with him at the end." Nate closed his eyes, and Marybeth saw the pain cross his face. A genuine pain for a man who had been technically his enemy, but with whom he had forged a human connection amid the chaos of war. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I should have been there. Perhaps I could have—" "No," interrupted Marybeth firmly. Don't blame yourself, no one could have done more. The best doctors in the hospital tried to save him, but some wounds are simply beyond our capacity to heal. Silence fell over them again, but now it was charged not only with pain but also with a strange sense of fulfilled destiny, as if the paths of all of them had been intertwined long before the storm led Mary Beth and her children to Nate's cabin. Elias approached, and with a maturity that wrung Mary Beth's heart, took the piece of uniform from Nate's hands. "My father wanted you to have it," he said solemnly. "You must keep it." Nate looked at the boy with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "No, Elias, now that I know who you are, this piece of cloth belongs to you more than to me." So Elias shook his head, as stubborn as only a Callahan could be. "My father gave it to you. It was a gift, and Mom always says you don't return gifts." A fleeting smile crossed Nate's face at the boy's logic. "Then I'll keep it as what it is," he finally replied. "A reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is room for compassion and recognition of our shared humanity." Mary Beth observed the exchange with moist eyes. In that moment, as her son and the man who had saved her husband shared that unexpected bond, she felt something within her being released. A knot she had carried tied to her heart since James's death began to untie, not to forget, but to allow the memory to transform into something she could carry without it crushing her. That night, while the children slept and the fire reduced to embers, Mary Beth and Nate remained seated side by side, their hands entwined in a gesture that no longer needed explanation. The past they had feared would separate them had, unexpectedly, become the bridge that united them. The snow began to melt with the arrival of February, revealing patches of dark earth under the white mantle that had covered the forest for weeks. Elias's leg improved day by day, and although he still needed the crutches, he could move with growing confidence around the cabin and its surroundings. The routine that had been established among them had the comfort of something that had always existed. Nate and Mary Beth working together in the greenhouse in the mornings, Clara learning the names and properties of plants with a surprising memory for her age, Elias keeping meticulous records of growth and flowering in a notebook that Nate had given him. The afternoons were dedicated to lessons for the children, with Mary Beth teaching reading and arithmetic, and Nate sharing his knowledge of botany and basic anatomy. At night, after the little ones went to bed, Mary Beth and Nate conversed by the fire, sometimes in low voices, sometimes in a shared silence that was equally eloquent. The idea of continuing to Montana had become a topic that both avoided, as if naming it could break the fragile balance they had found. It was during one of those peaceful afternoons, while Mary Beth was teaching Clara to knit with improvised needles and wool that Singing Bird had brought on her last visit, when the sound of approaching hooves alerted everyone in the cabin. Nate, who was showing Elias how to prepare a tincture, raised his head abruptly, his expression tensed as he approached the window. "Visitors," he murmured, with an intonation that made it clear he neither expected nor desired them. 3 men on horseback. Mary Beth joined him at the window. Indeed, 3 riders were approaching along the path that led to the cabin. Even at a distance, the rigidity of their postures and the deliberation of their movements suggested that this was not a casual visit. "Do you know them?" she asked, feeling an inexplicable uneasiness. Nate nodded, his jaw tense. "The one on the black horse is Jedediah Fletcher, owner of the general store in Silver Creek, the nearest town. The tall one is Thomas Young. He works at the sawmill. The third one I don't recognize." There was something in his tone that put Mary Beth on alert. Instinctively, she positioned Hua herself next to her children, a protective gesture as old as motherhood itself. "Should we be concerned?" she asked in a low voice. Before Nate could respond, the riders reached the clearing in front of the cabin and dismounted. Jedediah Fletcher, a corpulent man with a reddish beard sprinkled with grey, stepped forward while the other 2 remained with the horses, their hands dangerously close to the weapons they carried at their belts. Nate headed to the door, but before opening it, he turned to Mary Beth. "Whatever happens, let me do the talking," he said in a grave voice. "These men have a history with me that predates your arrival." Without waiting for a response, he opened the door and went out onto the porch. Mary Beth, ignoring his warning, followed him, leaving the children inside with strict instructions to stay by the fire. Fletcher, Nate greeted with a nod. Young. It's been a while, Carson, replied Fletcher, his voice as rough as gravel. We're not here on a social visit. You never are, retorted Nate with studied calm. What can I do for you this time? Fletcher directed a curious look toward Mary Beth, evaluating her with narrowed eyes. I see you have company, he commented. I didn't know there was a woman living with you now. Mrs. Callahan and her children are my guests, Nate clarified. Their wagon overturned during last month's storm. The boy was injured. Thomas Young, tall and lanky with a scar that crossed his left cheek, stepped forward. Callahan, he asked, his voice surprisingly soft for a man of his appearance. From Virginia. Mary Beth felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in the way the man had pronounced Virginia that contained echoes of the war that had never really ended for many. Yes, she responded firmly. My late husband was Lieutenant James Callahan of the 14th Virginia. Young and Fletcher exchanged a look laden with meaning. Ma'am, said Fletcher, removing his hat with a gesture that was intended to be respectful but came across as threatening. Are you aware of who the man you're staying with really is? Before Mary Beth could respond, Nate stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of her in a protective gesture that did not go unnoticed by the visitors. Fletcher, if you've come to stir up the past, you're wasting your time, he said with a cold voice. Mrs. Callahan and her children will depart for Montana as soon as the boy is fully recovered. Does she know you were a doctor at Libby? Insisted Fletcher, ignoring Nate's words. Does she know how many Union soldiers died under your care? Mary Beth felt the air thickening around her. Libby, the infamous Confederate prison. Nate had told her about his experience there, but evidently these men had a very different version of the events. Dr. Carson has told me about his past, she intervened, her voice firm despite the trembling she felt in her hands, including his time at Libby, where he was sent as a prisoner and forced to attend to the sick with insufficient resources. Fletcher let out a dry laugh, devoid of humor. Is that what he told you? He asked, addressing Mary Beth directly for the first time. Did he tell you that he let Union soldiers die while he saved medicines for the Confederate guards? Did he tell you about the men who begged for clean water while he washed his hands with it? That's a lie. Elias's voice resonated from the door of the cabin, where he had appeared leaning on his crutches, with Clara half hidden behind him. Dr. Nate saved my father. He told him so himself. A tense silence followed the boy's intervention. Mary Beth moved instinctively toward her children, while Nate remained motionless, his face an impenetrable mask. What is the boy talking about? Asked Young, his voice sharp as a knife. Mary Beth lifted her chin, facing the hostile looks of the visitors. Dr. Carson operated on my husband in Washington after Gettysburg, she explained calmly. He saved his life, although James later succumbed to an infection. Before dying, my husband gave him a piece of his uniform as a token of gratitude. Dr. Carson has kept it all these years. The revelation seemed to momentarily destabilize Fletcher and Young. The third man, who had remained silent until then, approached Fletcher and whispered something in his ear. Fletcher nodded, his expression hardening again. A touching coincidence, he said with disdain, but that doesn't change what happened at Libby. My cousin died there, ma'am, and many others like him. I know, replied Nate, speaking for the first time since the arrival of the children. Robert Fletcher, typhus. I tried to save him with quinine I had obtained through a guard who owed me a favor. It wasn't enough. I buried him myself, Fletcher, and recited the prayers he told me were important to him. Fletcher's face contorted, with a mixture of pain and rage. Lies, he spat. Just lies to gain the sympathy of this woman and her children. That's enough, intervened Mary Beth with a firm voice. I would appreciate if you left. You're frightening my children. Fletcher looked from Mary Beth to Nate, then to the children, and finally to his companions. After a tense moment, he put his hat back on. This isn't over, Carson, he warned. The war may have ended for some, but not for everyone. The three men mounted and rode away at a trot, leaving behind a wake of tension that seemed to remain in the air long after they disappeared among the trees. When they finally entered the cabin, Nate collapsed into a chair by the fire, his face somber beneath his carefully trimmed beard. I should have warned you about this, he said, passing a hand over his tired face. "Fletcher comes every few months. I never thought he would appear now." Mary Beth sat across from him, taking his hands in hers. "You don't have to explain anything to me," she said softly. "I believe you. I believed you when you told me about Libby. And I believe you now." Nate looked at her, surprise evident in his clear eyes. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why trust my word over theirs?" Mary Beth reflected for a moment, searching for the right words. "Because I've seen your hands heal," she replied. "Finally, I've seen how you treat my children, how you cared for little Wolf. I've seen your greenhouse, your dedication to preserving life." She paused, squeezing his hands slightly. "And because I understand the weight of guilt, Nate, I understand how it can distort the truth until it makes us believe we are responsible for tragedies that were beyond our control." The children approached, Clara sliding under Nate's arm while Elias remained standing next to Mary Beth, his expression so adult that it hurt to see it. "Those men were wrong," said Elias with conviction. "My father trusted you, Dr. Nate, and I do too." Nate looked at the boy, then at Clara, and finally at Mary Beth. In his eyes shone something she hadn't seen before, not just gratitude, but also hope. The fragile hope of one who has lived too long under the weight of a painful past. And glimpses, for the first time, the possibility of a different future. "Thank you," he said simply, the words laden with a meaning that went far beyond their apparent simplicity. That night, while the children slept, Mary Beth and Nate remained by the fire longer than usual. Fletcher's visit had brought to the surface issues that had been floating between them, unspoken but present. "You should continue to Montana," Nate finally said, breaking the silence. "Fletcher and his friends can be dangerous. I don't want you and the children to be caught up in my problems." Mary Beth contemplated the flames, considering his words. The decision she had been postponing now demanded to be made. "Is that what you want?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "For us to leave?" Nate closed his eyes as if the question caused him physical pain. "What I want and what is best are different things," he replied after a long moment. "I've never had this." He made a gesture encompassing the cabin, the sleeping children, the space between them. "I never thought I could have it. But Fletcher is right about one thing. My past always catches up with me." Mary Beth stood up and sat beside him, so close that she could feel the heat of his body. "We all carry our past with us, Nate," she said softly. "The difference is in whether we allow it to define us, or if we decide that it's just a part of who we are." Nate looked at her, and in the fluctuating light of the fire, Mary Beth saw in his eyes everything he didn't dare to ask, everything he feared to lose. "Stay," he said finally, the word escaping from him like a prayer. "Not because it's safe or sensible, or what you had planned, but because here together we can build something that neither of us thought we would have again." Mary Beth took his face in her hands, a gesture so intimate that it made them both hold their breath. "I'll stay," she replied, "not because it's easy or safe, but because here, with you, I've found something I thought lost forever. A place where wounds can heal, where the past is not a condemnation, but a lesson. A place we could call home." The word home hung between them, resonating with all the promises and all the risks it contained, and when Nate leaned toward her, when their lips met in a kiss that was both an ending and a beginning, Mary Beth knew she had made the right decision. The fire crackled, sending arcs toward the chimney like small shooting stars, silent witnesses to a pact sealed without words, the commitment to build something new together on the foundations of all they had lost. It was the smell that woke Mary Beth. Acrid, invasive, unmistakably threatening. She opened her eyes to the darkness of the cabin, momentarily disoriented. Beside her, Nate was already sitting up, tense like an animal that perceives danger before seeing it. "Smoke," he said, the word laden with urgency. "Wake the children, quickly." She needed no further explanations. With the efficiency born of one who has faced emergencies before, Mary Beth headed toward the cots where Elias and Clara slept, shaking them gently but firmly. "Up, we need to leave," she whispered, keeping calm in her voice to avoid alarming them unnecessarily. "Put on your coats and boots, now." While the children obeyed, still drowsy but sensitive to the tension in the air, Nate moved around the cabin, with purpose, collecting essential items. His medical bag, a rifle he kept above the fireplace, a bag of provisions he always kept prepared. The smoke was beginning to filter through the cracks in the door and windows, growing denser. When Nate opened the door slightly to assess the situation, a gust of hot air entered the cabin, confirming their fears. "They've set fire to the stables," he informed, closing quickly, "and they've surrounded the cabin. Fletcher and at least 5 more men." Mary Beth felt the cold of fear spreading down her spine, but she forced herself to maintain composure for the children, who were now fully awake and terrified. "Is there another way out?" she asked, quickly evaluating the options. Nate nodded, heading toward the greenhouse. "This way. There's a back door that leads to the forest. I used it to collect plants without having to go around the cabin." He guided them through the greenhouse, where smoke was also beginning to filter in, threatening the delicate plants that had been their sustenance and healing. Mary Beth noticed how Nate hesitated for an instant, looking one last time at his refuge, the place he had built with such care. Then, with a gesture of resignation, he continued toward the back door. Outside, the night was illuminated by the orange glow of the fire that was devouring the stables and beginning to spread toward the cabin. The voices of the men resonated. In the clearing, their silhouettes moving against the flames like demons emerged from an earthly hell. "Carson!" Fletcher's voice rose above the crackling of the fire. "We know you're in there. It's time for you to pay for what you did." Nate guided the small group toward the protection of the trees, moving as silently as possible through the half-melted snow. Elias struggled to keep pace despite his injured leg, his determination visible in each painful step. Clara, clinging to Mary Beth's hand, trembled, but made no sound, instinctively aware of the danger that lurked. "We must reach the stream," Nate whispered when they had gone far enough to speak. "From there we can follow its course to the Shoshone camp. Singing Bird will take us in." Mary Beth nodded, but her heart contracted as she looked back and saw the orange glow growing in the darkness. The cabin that had been their refuge, that had begun to feel like a home, was being devoured by flames. With it burned Nate's medical books, the carefully cultivated plants, the small treasures that Clara had collected during their stay, Elias's notebook with his meticulous records. All the tangible aspects of the life they had begun to build together were turning to ashes. As if reading her thoughts, Nate took her free hand. "They're just things," he said with a soft but firm voice. "What matters is here, with us." They advanced through the forest with difficulty, guided only by the moonlight filtering through the bare branches of the winter trees. The cold was biting, but at least the snow had melted enough not to leave obvious tracks. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached the stream, its partially frozen surface gleaming like liquid silver under the moonlight. "Can you continue, Elias?" asked Mary Beth, noticing how her son was leaning more and more on the improvised crutches, his face pale from effort and pain. "I'm fine, Mom," he replied with that stubborn determination that reminded her so much of his father. "We can keep going." But before they could resume their march, the sound of hooves and voices reached them, approaching rapidly. "They're following us," exclaimed Clara, her voice barely a frightened whisper. Nate scanned the surroundings, quickly evaluating their options. "There's a cave not far from here," he said finally. "The Shoshone used it as a shelter during hunts. We can hide there until it's safe to continue." With renewed urgency, the group followed the course of the stream until they reached a rocky formation that rose like an unexpected protuberance in the mostly forested landscape. There, almost invisible among the vegetation, opened the mouth of a small cave. The interior was cold but dry, deep enough to keep them hidden, but not so much as to get lost in dark tunnels. Nate gestured for everyone to remain silent while he approached the entrance, rifle in hand, to keep watch. Mary Beth embraced her children, trying to transmit warmth and security. Clara curled up against her chest, while Elias, though trying to maintain his facade of bravery, leaned against her shoulder, finally yielding to exhaustion. "Why do they hate us so much?" asked Clara in a low voice. "Dr. Nate has only been good to us." Mary Beth stroked her daughter's hair, seeking words to explain the inexplicable, how hatred can persist long after battles have ended, how wounds can become infected with the poison of resentment if not allowed to heal properly. Sometimes, darling, she finally replied, people cling to pain because it's the only thing they have left of those they've lost. Mr. Fletcher lost someone in the war, and he hasn't found a way to let go of that pain. Like you with Dad, observed Elias, always perceptive, but you don't hate anyone. Mary Beth felt a lump in her throat. Wasn't it true, after all, that she too had clung to the pain of losing James? Hadn't that pain been what drove her to leave Virginia? To seek a place where memories wouldn't pursue her at every corner. We all deal with pain in different ways, she said softly. I've had the fortune of having you, of having something to keep going for. Nate returned from his watch, his expression grave but not alarmed. They've passed close by, but haven't found our trail, he informed, sitting beside them. I think they assume we're heading directly to the nearest town, not to the Shoshone camp. A reflective silence fell over the group. The cave, though cold, protected them from the wind, and Nate's body, now seated next to Mary Beth, added a comforting warmth. I'm sorry, he said after a long moment, his voice laden with a guilt that Mary Beth knew too well. I should never have allowed you to stay. I knew Fletcher wouldn't stop. I knew this could happen. Don't talk like that, interrupted Mary Beth firmly. It was you who saved us during the storm. Without you, Elias would have died, and perhaps Clara and I as well. You can't blame yourself for the evil of others. Mom is right, intervened Elias, his voice surprisingly adult in the penumbra of the cave. You are not responsible for what those men do, Dr. Nate. Nate looked at the boy and then at Mary Beth, his eyes reflecting a silent amazement at this family that, against all logic, offered him comfort in the midst of the loss they had suffered because of him. When we reach the Shoshone camp, he said finally, I can get you provisions and a guide to take you safely to Montana. Your cousin will be expecting you. Mary Beth felt something tense in her chest. Despite everything that had happened, despite the danger and loss, the idea of separating from Nate was unbearable to her. In these months, without realizing it, they had woven something precious between them, something that went beyond gratitude or attraction, something that remarkably resembled home. No, she said with a conviction that surprised even herself. We are not going to separate, not after all this. Nate looked at her with a mixture of hope and fear. Are you sure? My presence in your lives will only bring you more danger. Fletcher is not the only one who bears a grudge from the war. And Montana is not the only place where we can start anew, replied Mary Beth, taking his hand in hers. You've spoken of Idaho, of that new settlement that needs doctors. We could go there, together, where no one knows us, where we can simply be who we are now, not who we were during the war. I want to stay with Dr. Nate, declared Clara, her voice small but decided. Hi's teaching me about medicinal plants. And I still have much to learn about botany, added Elias, a smile appearing for the first time since they had fled the cabin. Nate looked at each of them, the amazement slowly giving way to something brighter, more like hope than he had felt in years. Idaho, he repeated, savoring the word like a promise. A new beginning. A new beginning, confirmed Mary Beth, and when their eyes met in the half-light of the cave, she sealed that promise. With a soft but determined kiss, aware that the children were watching but not caring. She had spent too much time hiding from the future, living in the shadows of the past. It was time to move forward, to build something new on the ashes of what they had lost. They spent the night in the cave, taking turns to keep watch, sharing the warmth of their bodies and the strength of their newly discovered determination. And when dawn began to tint the sky visible from the entrance with pink, Mary Beth felt something within her finally aligning, like the pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered for too long. The path to the Shoshone camp would be long and dangerous. The journey to Idaho even more so. But for the first time since the war had taken James from her, Mary Beth didn't feel that she was fleeing, but advancing toward something, not moving away from a painful past, but heading toward a future that, though uncertain, shone with a promise she was willing to embrace. The Shoshone camp received them with the silent dignity that characterized its people. Singing Bird, upon seeing them arrive, exhausted and with little more than what they were wearing, asked no unnecessary questions. Her eyes, wise and deep like ancient wells, seemed to read the entire story in their dirty faces and their clothes scorched by the smoke. "The pale-eyed men have burned your dwelling," she said simply, not as a question, but as a statement. Nate nodded, fatigue evident in every line of his face. Fletcher and his men, they sought revenge for old grudges. Singing Bird gestured toward the center of the camp, where several women were already preparing a space for the newcomers inside a spacious teepee. Revenge is like a fire that consumes. First the one who feeds it, she commented as she guided them. Those men carry hell inside, that's why they need to create it outside. Mary Beth, holding an exhausted Elias, felt a deep gratitude toward this woman who offered refuge without hesitation, who understood without need for extensive explanations. The following days passed in a kind of tranquil limbo. The Shoshone camp existed in a different rhythm than the outside world, marked by natural needs and the cycles of the earth rather than by clocks or calendars. Here, while Elias recovered from the excessive exertion and Clara learned, fascinated, the traditions of the Shoshone children, Mary Beth and Nate had time to reconsider their plans. One afternoon, while helping Gentle Rain prepare medicines for Little Wolf, who had now fully recovered from scarlet fever, Mary Beth felt Singing Bird's presence beside her. The old woman observed her hands working with the herbs, nodding with approval at her growing skill. "You have hands that know how to listen to plants," she commented. "Like Nate Carson." Mary Beth smiled, recognizing the compliment in all its dimension. "He has taught me a lot," she replied. "Before I only knew how to heal with what others prepared. Now I'm learning to find medicine in the earth itself." Singing Bird nodded, her eyes fixed not on Mary Beth's hands but on her face, as if searching for something deeper than medical skills. "Do you know why we call Nate Carson Medicine Man?" she asked after a moment. "It's not just because he heals bodies. It's because he himself was broken when he came to us, and yet he found a way to heal others. That is the true gift of the healer, transforming one's own pain into medicine for others." The words resonated in Mary Beth like a clear bell on a winter morning. Wasn't that what she herself had been doing as a nurse? Transforming the pain of losing James into the ability to alleviate the suffering of others. "I see that you understand," continued Singing Bird, observing the recognition in her gaze. "You and he are like two halves of the same medicine. Together, you can heal more deeply than apart." That night, while the children slept and the full moon bathed the camp with its silvery light, Mary Beth and Nate walked together to a small clearing nearby. The stars seemed so close they could almost be touched, the air cold but not merciless. "I've been thinking," began Nate, his voice tranquil in the stillness of the night. "The settlement in Idaho, Clearwater Creek, is about 2 weeks' journey away. Running Eagle says he can get us horses and sufficient provisions." "And Fletcher?" asked Mary Beth, expressing the concern they both shared. "If he follows us," Nate shook his head, "the Shoshone know paths that white men have never trodden, roads that don't appear on any map. Singing Bird says we can travel by what they call the invisible path." He paused, his profile outlined against the starry sky. "But before we make that decision, I need to be sure that it's what you truly desire. Montana is still an option. Your cousin expects you. You have a place there, a planned life." Mary Beth contemplated the sky, the constellations so different from those she had known in Virginia, and yet eternally familiar. Wasn't life like that? Different scenarios, different circumstances, but the same basic human yearnings. Security, purpose, connection. "Do you know what I missed most after losing James?" she asked softly. "It wasn't so much his physical presence, though I terribly missed that too. It was the feeling of having a companion on the journey. Someone with whom to share not only the moments of joy, but also those of doubt, of fear. Someone who would understand without need for exhaustive explanations." She turned to him, her face illuminated both by the moon and by a decision already made. "With you I've felt that again, Nate. That complicity, that mutual understanding that is born not only from affection, but also from having walked similar paths, from knowing the same kind of wounds." Nate took her hands in his touch warm against the cold of the night. "I can't promise you it will be easy," he said, his voice grave with sincerity. "Clearwater Creek is barely a handful of cabins on the frontier. We won't have the comforts that Montana could offer you." "And what are comforts compared to having a purpose?" she replied. In Montana, we would be outsiders, depending on my cousin's charity. In Clearwater, we can be needed, useful. You as a doctor, I as a nurse and midwife. We can build something together, Nate. Something that is ours. Nate's expression softened, amazement and gratitude mixing in his clear eyes. I never thought I would have a second chance, he confessed. After the war, after Libby, I assumed my life would always be solitude, isolation, that it was what I deserved. No one deserves perpetual solitude, replied Marybeth, placing a hand on his bearded cheek. We all deserve the opportunity for redemption, to begin again. Even those of us who have seen the worst of humanity, or perhaps, especially us, under the mantle of stars. They sealed their decision with a kiss that tasted of promise, of future, of possibilities not yet written. And for the first time since the war had devastated their previous lives, both felt that the past was finally beginning to release them from its claws, allowing them to look ahead with something resembling hope. The preparations for the journey began the next day. The Shoshone, generous beyond what Marybeth would have expected, provided not only horses and provisions, but also maps drawn by hand on cured hides, showing routes known only to them, secret paths that wound through mountain passes and hidden valleys. Elias, fascinated with these maps, spent hours studying them alongside Running Eagle, who patiently taught him to interpret the symbols and marks that represented water sources, natural shelters, and places of potential danger. Clara, for her part, followed, Singing Bird like a shadow, absorbing knowledge about medicinal plants and their uses with an avidity that surprised even the old healer. Your daughter has the gift, commented Singing Bird to Marybeth one afternoon, as they watched Clara identify herbs with surprising precision. She sees what others cannot see. She hears what the plants whisper. Marybeth observed her daughter with new eyes, noting the delicacy with which her small fingers touched each leaf, each stem, as if she were communicating with living, conscious beings. She never showed this interest in Virginia, she reflected aloud. Perhaps because there, the land still screams with the pain of the war, replied Singing Bird. It is difficult to hear whispers when there are screams in the background. The wisdom of the old woman, expressed with the simplicity of one who has seen too much to complicate the evident, stayed with Marybeth during the following days. She wondered how much she herself had been screaming internally since James's death, how much of that noise had prevented her from hearing the more subtle whispers of life continuing around her. The night before their departure, the Shoshone camp organized a ceremony to bless their journey. Around a central fire, larger and brighter than the usual ones, the entire community gathered. They sang in their language, melodies that rose and fell like the wind among the trees, rhythms that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. Little, Wolf, fully recovered, approached Elias and gave him a small object, a whistle carved from bone decorated with symbols that Marybeth did not recognize. To call the protective spirits if you get lost on the way, explained the boy with the seriousness of one who transmits sacred knowledge. 3 short blows to ask for help, 1 long one to give thanks, ainsi basin aleo. Sias accepted the gift with the appropriate solemnity, intuitively understanding the importance of the exchange. To Clara, Gentle Rain presented a small leather bag decorated with beads, full of carefully selected seeds, so you can start your own medicine garden, she said, smiling at the evident delight of the girl. Each seed has a story that I have taught you. Remember them as they grow. When it was Marybeth's turn, Singing Bird approached, holding something wrapped in a piece of soft hide. Upon unwrapping it, she revealed a necklace, a leather cord from which hung a polished stone of a deep green veined with white lines. Jade, explained the old woman, placing the necklace around Marybeth's neck, the stone that heals the healer, so that you remember to take care of yourself while caring for others. Marybeth touched the stone, feeling its comforting weight against her chest, right over her heart. Thank you, she said, the words insufficient to express the gratitude she felt not only for the gift, but for all the wisdom and refuge that this woman and her people had provided them. Finally, Running Eagle approached Nate, carrying in his hands a long object wrapped in cloth. Upon revealing it, Marybeth saw that it was a staff carved from A single piece of light wood, with the shape of a snake that coiled along its entire length. "The medicine man's staff," explained Running Eagle, "so that you may lean on it when the path is difficult, and so that you remember that even poison can be turned into medicine in the right hands." Nate accepted the staff, visibly moved. Mary Beth knew that for him this gift represented much more than physical support. It was a recognition of his path of healing, both that which he had provided to others and that which he had found for himself. That night, while the camp slept and only the embers of the ceremonial fire remained, Mary Beth contemplated her sleeping children and Nate, who stood guard a few steps away. The dying light of the fire illuminated his profile, softening the lines of worry that usually marked his face. Tomorrow they would embark on a journey into the unknown, along paths invisible to most, toward a future they could not foresee. Yet Mary Beth felt a strange calm. The losses were still there, James, her home in Virginia, now Nate's cabin, but they no longer defined the totality of her existence. Now there were also findings, the strength she didn't know she possessed, the capacity of her children to adapt and flourish in the most adverse circumstances, and this man whose wounds complemented hers in ways she was just beginning to understand. With the jade stone pressed against her palm, Mary Beth made a silent promise to the stars that shone through the upper opening of the teepee. She would move, forward not with fear but with hope, not seeking to forget the past, but incorporating it into the new life they were about to build. They had been traveling for 5 days along the invisible path when Nate detected the first signs that they were being followed. They were subtle indications, broken branches that had not been caused by animals, tracks partially erased in the few stretches where snow persisted, the inexplicable nervousness of the horses at dawn. "Fletcher," confirmed Running Eagle, who had insisted on accompanying them at least during the first part of the journey. "He and 3 more men. They found our trail 2 days ago." Mary Beth felt the fear, which she had kept at bay during the time in the Shoshone camp, returning like a cold claw pressing on her chest. "How is it possible?" she asked, lowering her voice so the children, who were riding ahead, could not hear. You said this path was unknown to white men." Nate and Running Eagle exchanged a grave look. "They have a tracker with them," explained Nate. "Someone who knows the ways of the forest better than most." "Thomas Young," added Running Eagle. "He lived among the Crow for a time after the war. He learned their ways of tracking." Mary Beth remembered the tall, thin man who had accompanied Fletcher to the cabin, the one with the scar on his cheek and eyes that seemed to see too much. "What do we do?" she asked, concern for her children eclipsing any other thought. "We cannot. Allow them to catch up with us. We have an advantage," replied Running Eagle, pointing toward the mountains that rose in the distance. "A White Eagle Pass. If we cross it before them, we can divert our path towards Snake River Valley. There is a gorge there, narrow, where 4 men on horseback cannot pass abreast." "An ambush," concluded Nate, understanding immediately. Running Eagle nodded. "Not to kill them," he clarified, "but to talk, to end this once and for all." Mary Beth looked toward her children, who rode unaware of the threat looming over them. Elias had gained color in his cheeks during the journey, his leg improving, day by day, thanks to the poultices that Nate applied each night. Clara hummed while collecting small samples of plants she found interesting, carefully storing them in the bag that gentle rain had given her. The idea of exposing them again to danger, to the violence they had left behind, was unbearable. But neither could they continue fleeing indefinitely, always looking over their shoulder, always expecting the past to catch up with them at their most vulnerable moment. "All right," she said finally, "but the children must be safe out of reach of any danger." "There is a place," replied Running Eagle. "A cave behind the waterfall of the gorge. They will be safe there with sufficient provisions. If something happens—" He left the sentence unfinished, but the meaning was clear. If something happened to the adults, the children would have a chance to survive until they could be found. The next 2 days were a race against time and against their pursuers. They rode more hours than planned, stopping only when the horses or the children were completely exhausted. Mary Beth noticed how Nate constantly scrutinized the horizon, his hand never far from the rifle he carried across his saddle. White Eagle Pass turned out to be a narrow gorge between two snow-covered peaks, so steep that they had to dismount and guide the horses along the treacherous path. The wind howled between the rocks, carrying with it fragments of ice that cut exposed skin like small knives. Clara cried silently during the ascent, her small hands reddened by the cold despite the gloves that Singing Bird had provided. Elias, determined not to show weakness, gritted his teeth each time his injured leg had to bear weight, but did not utter a complaint. When they finally reached the summit of the pass, the panorama that stretched before them would have taken Mary Beth's breath away under other circumstances. An extensive valley, flanked by majestic mountains, with a serpentine river that gleamed like a silver ribbon under the setting sun. "Snake River Valley," announced Running Eagle, allowing them a brief moment to appreciate the view. "The gorge is half a day's journey, following the course of the river northward." They descended with renewed urgency, aware that their pursuers would not be far behind. At nightfall they established a minimal camp, without a fire to avoid giving themselves away, sharing pemmican and hard bread while huddling under blankets to conserve heat. That night, while the children slept and Running Eagle stood guard, Mary Beth found Nate sitting on a flat rock at some distance from the camp, contemplating the stars with an indescribable expression. "You should rest," she said, sitting beside him. "Tomorrow will be a difficult day." Nate nodded, but made no move to leave. His eyes remained fixed on the night sky, as if seeking answers among the constellations. "What are you thinking?" asked Mary Beth after a moment of shared silence. "About how a moment can change everything," he replied, his voice barely audible over the whisper of the wind. "If there hadn't been a storm that day, if your wagon hadn't overturned near my cabin, you would be in Montana now, beginning that new life you had planned, safe, without a man whose past puts your children in danger." Mary Beth took his hand, feeling the coldness of his fingers against hers. "And I would be incomplete," she replied softly. "I would still be fleeing from memories, instead of learning to incorporate them into a new life. The children would still be seeing a ghost of their mother, instead of the complete woman I am becoming again. I wouldn't change what we have found. Nate, not even in exchange for safety. But now you face a danger you never asked for," he insisted, guilt evident in his voice. "Fletcher won't stop. Even if we manage to dissuade him tomorrow, his hatred will find another form, another moment. Then, we'll face it," replied Mary Beth with a firmness that surprised even herself. "Together, as we have faced everything else." Nate looked at her then, and in the silvery light of the moon, Mary Beth saw the amazement in his eyes, the recognition of something that perhaps he himself had not fully understood until that moment, that he was no longer alone in his struggle, that his burdens were no longer exclusively his to bear. "I love you," he said simply, the words coming from him as if they had been waiting a long time to be pronounced. "I didn't plan for this to happen. I didn't believe I deserved—" Mary Beth silenced his doubts with a kiss, her lips finding his with the certainty of one who has made an irrevocable decision. "Love is not a matter of deserving," she whispered against his mouth. "It is a gift that is offered freely, and I offer it to you, Nathaniel Carson, with all that it entails, the danger, the uncertainty, the past that we both carry. I choose you with all of it." Under the mantle of stars, with the wind from the mountains as the only witness, they sealed a promise that went beyond words. And when they finally returned to the camp for their brief rest, they did so with the tranquility of those who, even in the face of imminent danger, have found an anchor that keeps them steady in the storm. The gorge turned out to be exactly as Running Eagle had described it, a narrow throat between walls of sheer rock, with the river running furiously at its base. At one point, where the path narrowed so much that it barely allowed the passage of a single horse at a time, a small waterfall fell from the western wall, creating a curtain of water behind which the entrance to a cave was hidden. "Here," indicated Running Eagle. "The children will be safe." Dismounting and preparing the refuge was a matter of minutes. Mary Beth arranged the provisions while Nate explained the situation to Elias and Clara, without alarming them, but without hiding the truth. "We need you to stay here safe while we talk with the men who are following us," he said, kneeling to be at their level. "It's not that we want to leave you alone, but it's the only way to protect you." "Are they going to hurt you?" asked Clara, her eyes large with fear. Like when they burned the cabin? Nate caressed her cheek with infinite tenderness. No, little. 1. We're going to talk to them to try to make them understand that the war ended a long time ago, that we have all suffered enough. Schleius, always more perceptive, looked Nate directly in the eyes. But they have weapons, he said, not as a question but as a statement. Yes, confirmed Nate without looking away, but we have something more powerful. The truth. And sometimes, Elias, the truth is enough to disarm even the most determined men. The boy nodded, understanding more than his 10 years would suggest. Take care of your sister, instructed Nate, placing a hand on his shoulder. And remember what little Wolf taught you about the whistle. 3 short blows if you need help. Mary Beth embraced her children, inhaling the scent of their hair, engraving in her memory the sensation of their small bodies against hers. We'll return before the sun sets, she promised, and when this is over we'll continue our way to Idaho, to our new home. With Dr. Nate? Asked Clara, her voice small but hopeful. Yes, darling, confirmed Mary Beth, exchanging a look with Nate over the children's heads. With Dr. Nate. Leaving the children in the cave was one of the most difficult acts Mary Beth had had to perform, comparable only to saying goodbye to James when he left for war. But this time she promised herself the outcome would be different. This time she would return because she had too much to live for, too much future to build. Running Eagle led them to a bend in the gorge, where the path widened slightly before narrowing again. There, with the river roaring several meters below, they dismounted and prepared their position. They will arrive soon, he informed, pointing toward the southern end of the gorge. The wind favors us. We will hear their horses before they see. Thus Nate checked his rifle, a gesture that seemed more routine than threatening. I won't fire unless absolutely necessary, he said, responding to Mary Beth's unasked question. There has been too much death already. Mary Beth nodded, grateful for his understanding. Although she knew that Fletcher and his men represented a real danger, the idea of more violence, more blood spilled over old grudges was unbearable to her. The sound of hooves on stone came soon after, exactly as Running Eagle had predicted. 4 riders advanced in single file along the narrow path, their silhouettes outlined against the light entering from the end of the gorge. Nate stepped forward, his tall, unmistakable figure blocking the way. "Fletcher," he called, his voice amplified by the rock walls. "This is as far as we go. It's time to talk." The riders stopped. Fletcher, in the lead, scrutinized the advantageous position of Nate and his companions. Even from a distance, Mary Beth could see him evaluating the situation, recognizing that they were at a strategic disadvantage. "Carson," he replied finally, "there's nothing to talk about. You've fled like a coward, but your debt remains unpaid." "What debt, Fletcher?" retorted Nate, his voice surprisingly calm. "Your cousin died of typhus in Libby, as hundreds of men died, both from the north and the south. Do you think you were the only one who lost someone beloved in that cursed war?" Fletcher dismounted, followed by his men. Thomas Young positioned himself at his side, while the other 2 remained slightly behind, their hands near the weapons. They carried at their belts. "My cousin wrote before dying," said Fletcher, advancing a step. "He said the Confederate doctor saved medicines for the officers, while the rank-and-file soldiers died like dogs." Nate shook his head, a gesture of tired denial. "Your cousin was delirious with fever when he wrote that letter," he replied. "I myself held his hand while he dictated it. There were no medicines to save, Fletcher. We used ground willow bark instead of quinine. We distilled alcohol from rotten potatoes to disinfect wounds. I myself fell ill twice from treating contagious men without adequate protection." A tense silence followed his words. Mary Beth, observing from her position, saw how Thomas Young looked at Nate with an expression that had subtly changed. It was no longer pure hatred, but a complex mixture where doubt began to infiltrate. "My brother was also at Libby," Young finally said, his voice strangely soft for a man of his size. "William Young, corporal of the 20th Maine. He never returned." Nate closed his eyes briefly, as if searching among his memories. "William Young," he repeated slowly. "Gunshot wound to the right shoulder. It became infected. Blonde hair, a half-moon-shaped scar under the left eye." Young's eyes opened with surprise. "You remember him," he said, more a statement than a question. "Remember all those I couldn't save," replied Nate with simplicity. "Your brother gave me something before he died. He said it should reach his family if I was ever released." With slow movements so as not to alarm the armed men, Nate extracted from his pocket a small object, a silver pocket watch, its surface stained by time and use. "He asked me to tell you that he regretted not listening to your advice," Nate continued, extending the watch toward Young, "that he should have stayed in Maine, fishing with his older brother as they had always planned." Thomas Young advanced as if hypnotized, his eyes fixed on the watch that had belonged to his brother. He took it with trembling hands, opening it to reveal inside a small discolored photograph, two smiling young men next to a fishing boat. "He always carried it with him," murmured Young, his voice breaking. "It was all we had of value. I cared for it as he promised me you would have cared for him," said Nate. "I cleaned his body, recited the prayers he taught me. I buried him with his hands crossed over his chest, as he told me your mother would have wanted." Thomas Young raised his gaze from the watch, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "All these years," he began but could not continue. Fletcher observed the exchange with evident disbelief, his resolution visibly affected by the unexpected turn of events. "How do I know it's not another lie?" he asked, but his voice no longer contained the same conviction. It was then that Mary Beth decided to intervene. She advanced until she stood beside Nate, her presence adding a new element to the equation. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, with the clarity and firmness she had developed as a nurse during the war, "my husband, Lieutenant James Callahan, died after. Dr. Carson saved his life in Washington. Before dying, my husband spoke to me about him, about how a captured Confederate doctor had shown more humanity than many of his own comrades in arms. About how that doctor had treated him not as an enemy, but as a wounded man who deserved care and respect." She paused, observing how her words impacted Fletcher, how doubt began to erode his certainty. "The war has taken too much from all of us," she continued. "It left me a widow with two small children. It took your cousin from you. It took Mr. Young's brother. It took Dr. Carson's home, his reputation, his peace. Isn't it enough? How much more blood do we need to spill before we say, 'Enough'?" A profound silence followed her words, broken only by the constant roar of the river several meters below. Fletcher looked at Young, who was still contemplating his brother's watch with a moved expression, and then at his other two men, who seemed increasingly less sure of the purpose of their pursuit. "The war ended almost 20 years ago, Fletcher," said Nate softly. "It's time to let the dead rest and the living move on." Fletcher passed a hand over his tired face, suddenly aged under the weight of a grudge he had carried for too long. "My cousin was all I had left," he said finally, his voice stripped of the anger that had fueled it during his pursuit. "I needed to blame someone for his death. I needed an enemy I could hate." "I understand," replied Nate, "but the real enemy was never the man on the other side of the battle line. It was the war itself, the collective madness that made us believe that killing our brothers would resolve our differences." Thomas Young stepped forward, his brother's watch now safe in his pocket. "It's over, Jed," he said, placing a hand on Fletcher's shoulder. "William wouldn't want this. Your cousin wouldn't either. Let the dead rest." Fletcher looked around as if awakening from a long trance. His eyes finally settled on Mary Beth, on the determination visible in her posture, on the hand she kept firmly intertwined with Nate's. "Where are you going?" he asked, a last vestige of his previous hostility. "Idaho," replied Nate. "Clearwater Creek. They're going to need a doctor there and a nurse." Fletcher nodded slowly as if assimilating the information. "It's a good place," he said finally. "New land without ghosts." Mary Beth felt something loosen in her chest, a tension that had been present for so long she had almost forgotten what it was like to live without it. Beside her, she perceived that Nate was experiencing something similar. A long sigh escaped from him, as if he could finally breathe completely. "The war is over, Fletcher," said Nate, extending his hand. "For all of us?" There was a moment of hesitation, a last instant when everything could have taken a different course. Then, with a movement that seemed to cost him physical effort, Fletcher grasped the offered hand. "The war is over," he repeated, the words sounding like a revelation, as if he was pronouncing them for the first time, not only for Nate, but also for himself. Thomas Young was the next to shake Nate's hand, his grip firm but no longer threatening. "My brother would have been proud," he said simply, "of both of us." The other two men, who had remained as silent spectators, nodded in acknowledgement, their previous hostility dissolved by the unexpected turn of events. As Fletcher and his men mounted to begin their return, Young turned one last time toward Nate and Marybeth. "Clearwater Creek is about 8 days to the northwest, following the river," he informed. "My cousin lives there. Tell him Thomas Young sends you. He'll help. You get established." With a final gesture of farewell, the four riders moved away the way they had come, their silhouettes gradually vanishing in the distance, taking with them the shadow of a war that, finally, was beginning to be truly left behind. Marybeth, Nate, and Running Eagle remained motionless until the sound of hooves was completely lost. Only then did they allow themselves the luxury of reaction. Marybeth collapsed into Nate's arms, the tears she had contained finally released, not from fear or sadness, but from pure relief. "It's over," she whispered against his chest. "It's really over." Nate embraced her tightly, his own body trembling slightly with the release of tension accumulated over decades. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "for being here, for believing in me when no one else did." Running Eagle observed the scene with a slight smile, the wisdom of generations reflected in his dark eyes. "Now you can follow your path," he said, "not as pursued but as travelers." Clara's joyful cry, emerging from her hiding place behind the waterfall with Elias limping after her, completed the moment. The children ran toward them, their faces illuminated by relief and renewed hope. And as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, bathing the gorge with a golden light that transformed even the most austere rocks into works of natural art, Marybeth understood that they were witnessing not only the end of a day, but also the definitive closure of a chapter in their lives. What would come after would be something entirely new, a blank page waiting to be written with the ink of their choices, their efforts, their shared hopes. The path to Clearwater Creek stretched before them, no longer invisible, but bright with promise, leading not to a temporary refuge, but to a true home. Clearwater Creek turned out to be exactly as Thomas Young had described it, a small but growing settlement, about 30 cabins distributed around a main street, with the river meandering lazily on one side and lush forests on the other. What Young had not mentioned, and what Marybeth immediately noticed upon arriving, was the extraordinary beauty of the place. Majestic mountains rising in the distance, their snow-capped peaks reflecting in the crystal-clear waters that gave the settlement its name. Young's cousin, an affable man named Robert Miller, kept his word to help them get established. He offered them an empty cabin at the northern end of the settlement, somewhat secluded but close enough to be part of the community. "It belonged to old Doc Sullivan," he explained as he showed them the simple 2-room structure. "He passed away last winter. Since then, we haven't had a doctor. People have been traveling to Boise when the need is serious, but it's a 3-day journey under optimal conditions." Nate toured the cabin with a critical eye, evaluating not only the structure but also the possibilities it offered. "It will need work," he commented, pointing to the roof that had some leaks and the windows that required repair. "But there's enough space for us and for a small practice." Marybeth observed how Elias and Clara enthusiastically explored what would be their new home. Elias's leg had healed remarkably during the journey, and although he still limped slightly, he no longer needed the crutches. Clara ran from one side to the other, excitedly pointing out the places where she could cultivate the seeds that gentle rain had given her. "It's perfect," she said, feeling certainty settling within her. "We can make it work." The first weeks were of adaptation and intense work. The community, upon learning that a new doctor had established himself, received the Callahan-Carson family, as Marybeth had begun to think of them, although they had not yet formalized their union, with a mixture of relief and curiosity. Men and women offered to help with the repairs to the cabin, contributing materials, tools, and willing hands. Nate, initially reserved as was his custom, gradually opened up as he treated the first patients, a child with a fractured arm, a woman with puerperal fever, a miner with an infection in a poorly healed wound. His competence and dedication soon earned him the respect of the community, and if anyone had questions about his past or about the war, no one formulated them directly. Mary Beth quickly found her own place. Her experience as a nurse made her an invaluable assistant to Nate, but she also began to establish her own practice as a midwife. The women of Clearwater Creek, initially reluctant to trust a newcomer, soon appreciated her combination of medical knowledge and natural empathy. Elias was accepted into the small school of the settlement, where his intelligence and interest in botany caught the attention of the teacher, a young man with progressive ideas about education. Clara, still too young for formal schooling, spent her days alternating between helping her mother with simple tasks and working in the small medicinal garden they had begun to cultivate behind the cabin, using the seeds gifted by the Shoshone. It was precisely that garden that became the symbolic heart of their new beginning. Each morning, before the bustle of the day began, Mary Beth would find Nate there, kneeling among the incipient sprouts, his large but delicate hands working the earth with the same precision he showed when treating his patients. One particularly beautiful morning in early summer, when the first rays of the sun turned the dew into ephemeral diamonds on the new leaves, Mary Beth joined him in this ritual. In silence, side by side, they weeded and watered, their movements synchronized by shared practice. "Singing Bird was right," commented Nate finally, contemplating a small sprout of the plant that the Shoshone called the one that whispers to bones. "This land is good for medicinal herbs. They grow strong here." Mary Beth nodded, observing how Nate's hands, those hands that had seen so much death and pain, now cultivated life with a moving delicacy. "Like us," she responded softly. "We too are putting down roots, growing anew." Nate looked at her, and in his clear eyes, Mary Beth saw a reflection of her own feeling, amazement at the path that had led them there, gratitude for the second chance that life had granted them. "I never thought I would have this," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "After the war, after Libby, I was convinced that my destiny was solitude, that it was what I deserved." "No one deserves solitude as punishment," replied Mary Beth, taking his earth-stained hand in hers. "And you least of all, Nate. You've dedicated your life to healing, to repairing what others have broken." An accomplice. Silence settled between them, filled not with unspoken words but with mutual understanding, with recognition of all they had shared and overcome together. It was Clara who broke the moment, appearing in the garden with a small object. In her hands, the carved bird figure that Singing Bird had given her. "Look, Mom," she said, showing her the carving. "Hey, Snowbird found its home," as Singing Bird said. Mary Beth smiled, caressing her daughter's hair. "Yes, little one," she confirmed. "We all have found it." That afternoon, while Nate attended to his patients and the children were busy with their respective activities, Mary Beth sat down to write 2 letters. The first, addressed to her cousin in Montana, explained her decision to settle in Clearwater Creek and thanked him for his offer of shelter, though it was no longer necessary. The second, more difficult to draft, was destined for Singing Bird and the Shoshone camp, informing them of their safe arrival and how the seeds and knowledge shared were flourishing in their new home. As she wrote, occasionally touching the jade stone she still wore around her neck, Mary Beth reflected on the strange and winding path that had led her there. If the wagon hadn't overturned during that storm, if Nate hadn't found Clara, if Elias hadn't discovered that piece of uniform in the trunk, so many seemingly accidental moments that, in retrospect, seemed perfectly linked chains of a destiny that revealed itself step by step. The door opened, interrupting her thoughts. It was Robert Miller, Young's cousin, with an expression of urgency on his face. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, removing his hat. "Is the doctor in? Jensen's wife is in labor, but something's wrong. She says the baby is coming breech." Mary Beth rose immediately, the nurse and midwife taking control. "The doctor is with a patient," she replied. "But I can go right now. I've attended many complicated deliveries." Miller nodded, visibly relieved. "I'll tell the doctor where to find you when he finishes," he promised. "Jensen lives at the end of the main street, the cabin with the blue porch." As she quickly gathered her bag with implements for delivery, Mary Beth experienced a strange sensation of déjà vu. How many times during the war had she been called like this, urgently, to attend emergencies where life hung by a thread. But this time it was different. This time it wasn't about repairing the damage caused by human violence, but about helping to bring new life into the world, to continue the natural cycle that no war could completely stop. The following hours were intense. Sarah Jensen, a young woman expecting her first child, was terrified but determined. Her husband, a burly man who seemed completely out of place in the small room where the drama was unfolding, alternated between absolute concern and blind confidence in Mary Beth's abilities. "You've done this before, haven't you?" he asked at a particularly difficult moment, when his wife moaned from an especially painful contraction. "Many times," assured Mary Beth, without looking up from her work. "Your wife and your baby are in good hands." And they were. Mary Beth had attended breech births during the war, when experienced midwives were scarce, and nurses had to assume responsibilities beyond their initial training. She had learned to stay calm, to transmit confidence, to combine technical knowledge with intuition and empathy. Nate arrived when the delivery was at its most critical point. Without need for words, he integrated into the process, his presence adding an additional level of calm and competence. They worked together with the synchronization they had developed during their shared months, communicating with looks and brief gestures, each anticipating the needs of the other. When finally the baby emerged, a healthy boy despite the complicated presentation, and his first cry filled the room, Mary Beth felt a wave of emotion so intense it almost made her stagger. Nate was at her side, his hand briefly on her back, a gesture of support and complicity. "You did wonderfully," he whispered, while she cleaned the newborn and wrapped him in a clean blanket. "We did it," corrected Mary Beth, placing the baby in the arms of his exhausted but radiant mother. Mr. Jensen, who had remained in a corner during the final phases of the delivery, approached with trembling steps to contemplate his son. Tears flowed freely down his face, weathered by sun and wind. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Both of you. You're like angels sent when we needed them most." Mary Beth and Nate exchanged a look, aware of how far they were from being angels, of how much pain and darkness both had known. But perhaps that was what made them effective in their work. They had walked through shadowy valleys and had emerged on the other side, not intact but more complete, more human. "It's our job," replied Nate simply, "and our privilege." They returned home when the sun was beginning to set, tinting the sky with orange and pink tones that reflected in the waters of the Clearwater River. The children were waiting for them. On the porch, alerted by Miller of where their parents were, Elias was reading a botany book that the teacher had lent him, while Clara played with the carved bird figure, making it fly over the pots where her first plants were beginning to grow. Upon seeing them arrive, the children ran to meet them, curious to know about the new baby. Mary Beth answered their questions, while Nate prepared a simple dinner, the domesticity of the scene vividly contrasting with the intensity of the previous hours. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Mary Beth and Nate sat on the small porch of their cabin, contemplating the stars that were beginning to appear in an increasingly dark sky. The sound of the river provided a relaxing backdrop, mixing with the crickets and the occasional hooting of owls in the nearby forest. "We need to expand the cabin," commented Nate, breaking the comfortable silence. "If we're going to have a proper practice and space for the children." Mary Beth nodded, her mind already visualizing the possibilities. "We could add a room in the back next to the garden," she suggested, "and perhaps a larger porch for hot days. And a greenhouse," added Nate, a smile appearing under his carefully trimmed beard. "Smaller than the previous one, but enough for the medicinal plants that wouldn't survive the winter." "Sounds like a project for a lifetime," observed Mary Beth, the implication of her words floating between them. Nate took her hand, intertwining, his fingers with hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Would you marry me, Mary Beth Callahan?" he asked with simplicity, without grand gestures or flowery words, just the direct honesty that characterized him. "Not to replace what you lost, but to build something new, something that is only ours." Mary Beth felt something expanding in her chest, a warmth that radiated from her heart to the tips of her fingers. It wasn't the vertiginous emotion of first love that she had felt for James so many years ago, but something deeper, more serene, but equally powerful, the recognition of two souls that had found in the other not only consolation but also redemption and possibility. "Yes," she replied simply, "to build something new, together." The wedding was a simple ceremony, celebrated in the small medicinal garden they had cultivated together. Reverend Wilson, who visited Clearwater Creek once a month, officiated the union before the community that had already accepted them as their own. Clara scattered petals of wildflowers collected that very morning, while Elias, serious and proud, delivered the rings, simple silver bands that Robert Miller had helped to obtain on his last trip to Boise. The most emotional moment came when, after the traditional vows, Nate knelt to be at the height of Elias and Clara. "I'm not only marrying your mother," he said, his voice grave but tender. "I'm also making a promise to you. I promise to care for you, guide you, and love you as if you were my own children. Not to replace your father, whose memory we will always honor, but to be by your side on the path that awaits you." Clara responded by throwing herself into his arms with the spontaneity of childhood. Elias, more reserved, extended his hand in a surprisingly adult gesture. "Welcome to our family, Dr. Nate," he said formally, though the emotion in his eyes betrayed his tone. Nate shook the offered hand, and then in an impulse drew the boy into an embrace that, after a moment of rigidity, was returned with equal intensity. Mary Beth observed the scene with silent tears sliding down her cheeks. In that moment, surrounded by the plants they had cultivated together, by the community that had welcomed them, by the love that had grown between them like an unexpected flower in a field devastated by war, she felt that a circle was closing. The pain had not completely disappeared, neither hers for James nor Nate's for the men he could not save, but it was no longer the center around which their lives revolved. It had transformed into something different, into understanding, into empathy, into the capacity to connect with the suffering of others and offer not only physical healing but also comfort for the spirit. That night, while the celebration continued in the center of the settlement, Mary Beth and Nate briefly retired to the garden. The full moon bathed the plants with its silvery light, transforming the humble space into something magical, almost ethereal. Nate took Mary Beth's hands in his, those hands that had known both pain and healing, that had held the dying and received newborns, that had planted seeds of hope in soil fertilized wit. "Shy tears, hands that heal," he murmured, kissing her palms with reverence. "That's what we are now, what we perhaps always were, even when we believed ourselves irreparably broken." Mary Beth felt something complete within her, as if a piece she didn't know was missing finally found its place. It wasn't an ending, she understood, but a new beginning. Pain and loss would always be part of their story, but they would no longer define their future. "Hands that heal," she repeated, intertwining her fingers with Nate's. "Not only bodies but also souls, beginning with our own." Above them, the stars shone with a clarity found only far from cities, each one a silent witness to the eternal cycles of loss and renewal, of death and rebirth, of wounds that, with time and proper care, not only heal but transform into sources of strength and wisdom. And in that garden, under the infinite sky of Idaho, Mary Beth and Nate sealed not only their union but also their shared commitment, to be hands that heal in a world that, even decades after the war that had marked their lives, still desperately needed the gentleness, compassion, and hope that both had learned to offer, born from the fire of their own suffering and tempered by the love they had found when they least expected it.